Welcome everyone. We're gonna give everybody just a minute to join the webinar. In the meantime, we have a couple of poll questions for you. So if you have a minute, go ahead and respond to the poll on your screen, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Welcome everyone. If you're just joining us, we're gonna get started in just a minute. If you could go ahead and respond to our poll question while you're waiting, that way we can see who's joining us. If you're just joining us, if you could respond to the poll, I'm going to close it out in just a second so we can go to our second poll question, but we're just getting a sense of who's joining us today. So go ahead and complete that poll and I'll close it out and then we'll do the second poll. All right, so it looks like we've got a great mix of people from almost all the categories, a lot of advocates here, some lawyers, law enforcement. Thank you all so much for joining us. And now we're going to find out where everybody is joining us from. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the second poll. All right, looks like we have a really good mix of people from the West Coast, Midwest, and East Coast, and just one person joining us from the South. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who this may be your first training that you're attending of Free to Thrive, my name is Jamie Beck, and I'm the President and Managing Attorney of Free to Thrive. And we are a San Diego-based nonprofit that provides legal services and other support to human trafficking survivors. I'm so thrilled to have you all today for the third part in our trauma training. For those of you who attended one or both of our last two trainings, you'll be very familiar with Dr. Brittany Greenbaum, who's one of our speakers. And we're really, really thrilled to have an incredible presentation and panel discussion following. So thank you all for joining us. I will say that as many of you likely suspected, as we got the word out about this training, this training is at a moment in time where we really need to understand not just how people who have experienced trauma are impacted by traumatic experiences that they have in their life, but also how society in general can cause trauma. And particularly with the work at Free to Thrive, how within the justice system people experience trauma. Just in the last few weeks at Free to Thrive, we've had, I can think of 3 clients off the top of my head who have experienced really traumatic things within the justice system that, you know, I believe really are tied to their race, tied to their gender, tied to their identity, and things that you know, different people are treated differently within our justice system, and it's really important that we understand how that works and how that impacts people long term. So I'm just absolutely thrilled to learn from this incredible group of speakers, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and we'll get it started. If you could, next slide. Thank you. So just if you have any technical issues today, you can reach out to our training coordinator, Elaine. Her contact info is there. For everybody who's a participant, you're muted and we can't see you. Sometimes I like to go for a walk while I'm watching or listening to a webinar, just as a way to get some fresh air. So if you're able to even move around or eat lunch, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, please do that. Note that there is a Q&A function or chat at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask questions during the webinar. We will have a Q&A at the very end, but you're welcome to ask questions as we go along, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. So before we dive right into this really important and pretty heavy topic, I want to take just a second for us all to ground ourselves and take a deep breath. I find that oftentimes that helps calm my nervous system, and hopefully it will help us all be prepared and ready to be present for this incredible training. So if you're comfortable closing your eyes, close your eyes. If not, lower your gaze and just take a long, deep, slow inhale through your nose, and a longer, slower, deeper exhale through your mouth. And with that, let's begin. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our presenters who will first, we're going to have a presentation, and then we'll go into a panel discussion after that, and they'll introduce our panelists. First, we have Shalisa Gladney, who is a violence prevention educator and is part of the rape victim advocacy program at the University of Iowa. And next we have Dr. Brittany Greenbaum, who is a staff therapist for the University Counseling Service, also at the University of Iowa. And with that, I will turn it over to Shalisa and Dr. Greenbaum. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
All right. So we're first going to start by talking about community agreement. And so we just want to establish community agreements while we're in this space together, especially when we get to the Q&A part. So for starters, commit to doing your best. And then also make space and take space. And what I mean by that is just being sure to, before you take any space, that you're making space for others to be able to contribute to the conversation. I also just want to mention that together we know a lot, and alone we actually only know a little. And then also to lean into any discomfort. And then last but not least, lessons will stay, or excuse me, lessons can leave, but stories will stay. So just thinking about confidentiality, and if someone discloses something about themselves, that you're not using that story to outside of the space today.
So why are we here? A few months ago, Jamie approached me and said she wanted to do something about the societal trauma like she was talking about, because she's seeing it on a day-to-day basis with our clients. And I approached Shalisa to do this presentation with me and to help get a panel together to better understand how do societal traumas, race, systematic oppression, how do all of these different systems impact survivor interactions within the justice system and lead to a system of oppression in our country?
All right, and so just want to give you an outline of where we're going. So we're going to start with some vocabulary. Some vocabulary. We often all like know some definitions, but we want to have a shared definition for this workshop. We're also going to explore a brief history of the United States, and I mean real brief. We're also going to connect that history to contemporary violence, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the socio-ecological model, and then we will connect all of this to human trafficking, and then we'll have a panel discussion with our wonderful panelists, and then end with a Q&A.
So vocabulary, like Shalisa said, we use these terms all the time, but we often don't consider what they mean or understand that we all have varying different definitions of the same word. So when we're using the term victim today, it's really a standard and common term that we use to identify somebody who's been through an extremely negative event. The event could be something that has directly impacted them or indirectly impacted them. And it's often a starting point for having gone through something negative. So once, if I've been assaulted, I am a victim. And from there, I can move into other statuses as I develop a sense of identity beyond just the victimization I've experienced.
All right, and then, so now we're going to briefly talk about survivor. And we often use these words interchangeably. So it's similar to victim and often used, but it's personal and objective. Many think of this space as like one where someone wants to get to. So once an individual has experienced violence or trauma and they have started the healing process, for this workshop, we'll primarily use survivor, but I also want to note that we are all professionals who have worked with victims and survivors, and we are not the voice of all folks who've experienced sexual harm. All right, and so now we want to talk a little bit about racism. So racism is a form of discrimination based on the belief that a particular group of people are inferior to another because of their race. And then it's also rooted in power and oppression. And we've seen this throughout the world. So thinking of like Nazi Germany, and then also throughout the US. And so thinking of like war on drugs or immigration. And so I also want to talk a little bit about structural and systemic racism. I'll start with systemic actually. So systemic is a form of racism that's embedded in the normal practices within a society or organization. It is a larger overarching system. So kind of like how the big picture, thinking of like how, the big picture of how society operates. This results in the exclusion or promotion of a designated racial group. And so structural or institutional racism is a form of racism that reinforces systemic racism. It is the normalization of acts that routinely advantage white folks while producing adverse or negative outcomes for people of color. This includes policies that perpetuate barriers to opportunities and racial disparities. So some examples of that would be, for instance, how low-income housing is built and where, so like the location of that, or how schools are funded by, or partially funded by housing taxes. And so think of like inner city schools versus suburban schools, or thinking of like public transportation and like who's utilizing that versus who is creating the policies and procedures for that.
And then we're going to just briefly define trauma, which if you've attended the other presentations, you've heard me say a number of times. So trauma is any significantly negative event that we experience, and they often inhibit our ability to cope and impact our ways of relating to ourselves, our relationships, and others. Societal trauma are traumas that are imposed and maintained by the societal structure order. So this can be historical, it can be systemic, it can be institutional. It is the ways in which we continually perpetuate harm by the way we've allowed our society to be set up and maintain its continuance. So when we're talking about this, it's really important to remember that there are different levels in which we're operating in our world. So we often like to talk like we're in a vacuum, but we're really not. We're all interacting with so many different things and people all the time. So when we're thinking about engaging in social justice with understanding our roles in our professions or our identities, we need to not just think about how I am with this, but how am I taking the beliefs and attitudes I have and how am I interacting with others with those ideas? And then how do the ideas that I have impact the way I relate to my community? So I believe in treating people with equality and with equity, and I believe in respect. So that's an individual belief that I hold. So relationally, when I'm engaging with someone, I do things that help me show that I value the person I'm talking to. In my community, I do this by speaking up and speaking out against things I don't agree with. And I do this by advocating for values that I find useful to promoting the health and well-being of others. And all of these things happen all the time within our society. So as we're all kind of engaging in more social justice work, I think it's important to say, what am I doing as an individual, and how does this ripple out into my relationships, community, and society? And alternatively, how does the society I'm in influence the way my community functions, the ways that people relate, and the ways and values I hold? The values I hold didn't just come to me because they're mine. They're imposed by me from the society I'm raised in. So the values I hold come from this system that we're in, just like others do as well. And we'll talk more about this in the panel discussion, and we'll pull this slide back up too.
All right, so now we're gonna do that little history lesson I told you all about. And so we're first going to start by talking about U.S. First People. It's also often called either Native folks or Native Americans. And so in the 1400s is the start of colonization, so an introduction of disease and alcohol, genocide, and a period of no grief. And then also thinking of like economic absorption, so dependency for survival resulted in loss of spiritual and cultural identity. Invasion and war. So this involved the extermination and refugee status in one's own land. And then confinement and translocation. So a relationship of forced dependency on the oppressor is formed. And then the family system being destroyed through beatings, rape, and prohibition of the native language and religion. And then forced relocation, so transfer to urban areas, prohibition of religious freedoms, racism, and being viewed as second class, loss of governmental system and community, and then again, no period of grief, and then continued violence, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so the next brief history lesson I want to mention is for Black folks or African Americans. And so from between 1600s and 1800s, the first enslaved Africans in Virginia, slavery becomes a commonplace institution. Slaves are being considered property and not human. They're also used as an economic benefit, so they're used as free labor. So in 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation, so it was declaring all slaves free, but then also thinking that reminding ourselves that the Ku Klux Klan is formed in response to the 13th Amendment. And so the family system being destroyed, again, through beatings, rape, prohibition of native languages and religion. And then just a brief mention of the civil rights era. So there are nonviolent protests, there are charismatic leaders and everyday people united in purpose. And then civil rights legislation is passed. And then also just a reminder that many of the civil rights leaders were killed. And then just thinking of continued violence, so systematic injustice, growing discontent and racial tensions become a way of life. Thinking of like segregation, and also I want to just mention here like some of the successes. So like thinking of the Harlem Renaissance, and then how Black folks also contributed to either entertainment or science. All right, and so briefly to connect those histories to some current day events and just seeing how it's still present. So if we think about the United States and our immigration services and policies, and then also thinking of like the Black Lives Matter movement and how that's currently, we're seeing a lot from that, but like also knowing that it didn't just start this year. And then also thinking of the Dakota Pipeline and also Black maternal mortality. all the way till today. We're currently in the midst of a global pandemic, so COVID, and how it's like disproportionately impacting communities of color. And then the last thing that I want to mention or tie in is just thinking about the US-Mexico border and all of the things that are around that. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Brittany.
All right, so connecting with human trafficking. Well, the first thing we have to acknowledge is that people have been enslaved for sexual purposes since probably as long as humans have been around. The earliest documentations that I've been able to find lead back to Christopher Columbus and him having some interactions with enslaved people for the purposes of sex. And we also know that a lot of people during slavery were enslaved to be sexual slaves to somebody. There's the fancy trade. We know that even within a particular community, there was this expectation that women were supposed to be engaging in sex. They needed to breed in order to produce more people to work the land for free. And so there's so many levels of sexual exploitation that happened within slavery that it is just unbelievable. But it's important to believe, because if we don't believe, then we're denying this really important part of history. So as difficult as it can be to face the fact that, as a white woman, my ancestors likely contributed to a lot of horrible things to people in this community. If I don't face that, I can't do different and take responsibility. And so I think that's partly what we're asking everybody here to do, is look at your own identities and what you bring in. How do you help make changes to create less societal traumas by taking responsibility? We also know that currently there is a disproportionate representation of marginalized communities involved in trafficking. So we have Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and other people of color who are continually being trafficked at higher rates than other individuals. And we know that in the US, Americans are most likely to be exploited here, but that doesn't mean not people of color, which I think some people mistake. So if we're looking at people in the US who are trafficked, we know that in King County, Washington, Black girls count for only 1.1% of the population, but they are 84% of those identified as trafficking victims. In South Dakota, Native people make up about 8% of the population, yet 40% of the trafficking victims identified in that area are Native women. In Louisiana, 49% of sex trafficking victims are Black girls, and they only make up 19% of the youth. So we see high rates of disproportionality in the trafficking community. In addition to that, the reason partially why that can happen is because there's all of these societal traumas. If there has been no economic opportunities for the family, if there's a lot of trauma within the family structure because of history of enslavement and lack of opportunity, poor housing opportunities, lack of educational opportunities, all of these can lead to increased likelihood to being trafficked. So societal traumas are inherent in every aspect of the human trafficking experience. And in addition, we even see societal traumas play out in the streets as a hierarchical system of oppression. We know that the individuals who are walking the streets are expected to have more clients per day and make less money per sex act. And that's money that they might not, most likely don't even get to keep because their pimp is likely keeping this. We know that people of color are often less likely to charge as much as people who identify as white. We know that people of color are often fetishized, and that people are often seeking them out for services because of the color of their skin. So for racist reasons, that they continue to be oppressed and exploited. So this doesn't just happen on this large society scale, but it happens in all these micro interactions all of the time. And in addition to that, racism changes the way that people see the person who's being victimized. We know that in the US, if you are an international victim from mostly Asian countries, that you're more likely to be perceived as a victim and get support in getting a trafficking visa. If you are a white girl in the US, you're more likely to be sent to a group home to get support. If you are a Black woman or a Latina woman who's being sexually trafficked, you are more likely to end up in jail for having committed violence towards somebody who's attacking you. So even if you do the same thing that someone else does of another color, you are more likely to receive harsher punishments if you are a person of color in the US. And this is statistically proven over and over again. We see a lot of media coverage on like Centoya Brown related to this lately. So this is a very important issue to the human trafficking community. And one last thing on that too, I just want to say that this isn't just in trafficking, this is also in pornography. And if you're interested in learning more about how racism and sexual violence against people of color plays out in pornography, please check out Dr. Carolyn West's research. It's quite fantastic. She has a great documentary coming out that says, let me tell y'all about Black chicks, imagery of Black women in pornography. And she's a very, very important and powerful voice in this. So. All right, we are going to move on to our panel discussion.
All right, so first we're going to start by introducing or letting our panelists introduce themselves. You can see their names and titles here. And so we'll start with Chandrea Trotty. All right. So let's actually start with Dr. Maria Bruno, and then we'll come back to Chandrea Trotty.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Bruno. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I currently serve as the Executive Director of Belonging and Inclusion for the University of Iowa. Prior to prior to this role, I worked as a clinical psychologist at the university for 4 years. And prior to that, I did some work in the juvenile justice system and also as a consultant.
Thank you. Can we go back to Chandrea Trotty? I think we're having trouble hearing you. Okay, we're gonna go to Scott Stevens and then we'll come back. All right.
Thanks, Shalisa.
Hi,
I'm
how are
Scott
you?
Stevens. Very well, thanks. I'm Scott Stevens. I'm a detective sergeant with the Iowa City Police Department. I've been in law enforcement for almost 18 years, where I've done a variety of things, and hope to be able to contribute today to today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we can hear you, Chandrea Trotty.
Yeah, my apologies for the technical difficulties.
No worries.
My name is Chandrea Trotty, as introduced. I currently work with the Council of State Governments Justice Center as the project manager, and I work with states to improve systemic responses to compensation, benefits, restitution practices, and I also work with state leaders to enhance all of those services for victim funds. Prior to coming here, I worked with the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We oversaw 99 counties and 27 member programs working with survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence.
Thank you for joining us. All right, and then also if we could have Judge Kevin McKeever introduce himself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin McKeever. I am a district court judge for Iowa's 6th Judicial District. A district court judge in Iowa, we are courts of general jurisdiction, so I handle a variety of cases, including criminal cases, probate cases, family law cases, and civil cases. Prior to my appointment to the bench, which occurred in September of 2015, I was a prosecuting attorney in the city of Muscatine. Those folks who are joining us from Iowa probably know where that is. I don't expect anyone else to. I also have in my legal background a little bit of corporate experience. I was a staff attorney for ACT Incorporated for about 3.5 years. And then prior to that, I worked actually in Minnesota, Ramsey County, Minnesota, as an assistant county attorney, and I did that for about 6 years. This is actually, the legal profession is actually my second career. I was an officer in the Navy for 7 years on active duty prior to going to law school.
All right, welcome. Thank you all for being a part of this panel. I'll actually turn it back over to Brittany to get us started.
All right, so if you can please go to speaker view. I should have said this much earlier, but so this way it pops up our speaker as they're talking. And if you have any questions for our panelists as we're going, please enter those into the Q&A and we'd be happy to get to those at the end of asking our questions. So this is a question we actually have for all of you, so we'll probably just have you answer as you'd like, or I'll let Shalisa kind of figure out our order here. But our question is, how do your identities impact your current professional role? So how do your identities such as race, ethnicity, gender, class, sexual orientation, and religion, and the intersection of those impact you in your role as a professional?
All right. Chandrea, would you like to get us started with that?
Sure, that is a loaded question. I think just recognizing as an African-American woman in a position of leadership who is heterosexual, coming from low income to middle class, and what that professional climb has looked like, it has been, it's a double-edged sword. Understanding the systems of oppression in many ways that manifests itself professionally over time, but also at the same time holding space for my privileges that I hold in comparison to other individuals that I may work alongside. And so being cognizant of both my advantages, challenges, and sometimes disadvantages, being a voice, knowing that it can be, it should be burdensome and a welcome burden sometimes to be a voice for myself, but that of others that may never have a seat at their table, but also at the same time navigating spaces in a way that educates and hopefully can elevate that of others so that we can continue to diversify. So again, a very loaded question, but in short, I think that's the way I would describe my experience and the way my intersecting identities have impacted the way I navigate a professional world.
Thank you. Now we'll go to, on my screen next is Dr. Bruno. So we'll go with Maria Bruno. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalisa. So I identify as a heterosexual cisgender Latina woman who also came from a poor background and am now considered upper middle class. I use my identities in ways that I never thought I would have to. I'll give you a very concrete example. When my hair is black, a lot of folks feel uncomfortable in my presence because I'm a very direct communicator. When I dye my hair lighter, people are more welcoming and accepting and receptive to what I have to say. Because I hold a terminal degree, which means a doctorate, I also get invited into tables where I'm always the only Latina woman. And so anytime I have an opportunity to share and bring awareness and teach about skills and knowledge, I will do that in regards to anti-oppression work. So I do a lot of advocacy, a lot of teaching, but I also recognize how I dress, how I look, what I wear is going to impact who listens to me and who does not.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Scott Stevens, would you be willing to go next?
Thanks, Shalisa. So a little bit about my background and kind of where I am today. I'm a white male. I'm a larger figured white male as well. And I come from a small town in Iowa. And for those of you maybe not familiar with the Midwest, a lot of small towns in Iowa spread out and are mostly white. So I went to the University of Iowa and very much broadened my horizons, opened my eyes, if you will. But where I come from in small town Iowa, I get humility. When I became a police officer, I recognized that my experiences were limited. I am dealing with people who have vastly different experiences than I do. And so I have taken every opportunity to learn from the people that I interact with, including people of color, people from different cultural backgrounds or religious backgrounds. And so I'm a student from the classroom, but also a student of my own interactions. I did for 5 years work as our domestic violence investigator, where I was put in a position as a male to work with a mostly female group of victim survivors. And every single interaction that I had with a person, I'm learning from that. You might find me asking questions. Maybe it can be annoying, but I meet somebody that may come from a different background than me, somebody who's experienced things differently than I have. And I'll ask them questions about that. Not that long ago, we celebrated Juneteenth. And following that was the 4th of July. I asked a young man, do you have any plans upcoming for this weekend, the 4th of July? And he says, no, we are not celebrating that. We celebrated Juneteenth. And I said, wow, I haven't heard that before. Are you comfortable telling me about that? And that young man did, and he explained it. We had a very great interaction. I learned a lot. I consider every interaction with a person I'm working with an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to hear about the experiences they've had behind their eyes with the world. And so that's where I come from. And I think the most important part of that is being humble to a person's interactions, being humble to a person's traumas that are coming out as they interact with the criminal justice system. I know what my badge, what my uniform represents when I'm on the street, and I'm aware of that. And so I will also do things deliberately to try to mitigate that when I see somebody who may have experienced past traumas or has a cultural or historical trauma may be associated with law enforcement. So that's a little bit about where I come from, and I think that's a little what I bring to the table today. But just understanding that we all come from a place, and that place can give us bias. Understanding what those biases are is important, and how those biases can affect your interactions with the persons you're dealing with.
All right, thank you very much. All right, and so we'll round out introductions with Judge Kevin McKeever.
All right, the question is actually fairly complicated for me, but I'll do the best I can to answer it. And the reason why it's complicated is the question asks, how does my identity impact my current professional role? So my current professional role is to provide a venue or a space, if you will, for members of society to settle their differences in a fair and peaceful manner. Now, that might sound like a simple task, but in fact, it really isn't. By virtue of my position, when I put on my robe and I walk out onto the bench, people expect certain things from me. They expect me to be wise. They expect me to be fair. They expect me to be able to sort through mountains of information and come up with a perfect solution. That's what we want. We want our justice system to be able to deliver those things that we are hoping can be delivered from one of the cornerstones in our society. And in fact, the justice system should serve as such a cornerstone. But obviously, we judges are people too. We do not have this ability to have some sort of clairvoyance to tell what's going to happen if we make a decision that, one order should be entered versus a different order. We like to think that we're fairly wise, but I can tell you that there's no one that I've ever met that knows everything, and that includes me and all the other judges that sit on the bench. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure to be able to deliver to the community. And really, I view my job as one of service to the community. And to be able to deliver that service in a way that is fair and a way that is peaceful is something that I hold in the front of my mind. So how does that relate to who I am? Well, I'm an African-American man. I am also, you can't tell by the screen, but I'm not a small person. I am ex-military, I'm an ex-athlete. I still lift weights. And so, when I have to be careful about how I interact with people, because sometimes if I ask a person a question and I'm really wanting to emphasize the need for them to answer, I don't want them to think that I'm angry with them or that I'm scolding them, but just that I've identified something that's very important for them to tell me. And so I'm highlighting that. So that's in my mind. It's also in my mind that a lot of people don't have a lot of trust for the justice system. I outlined at the very beginning of my remarks that there are certain things that the justice system is supposed to do. But I think if you ask most people in our society would say that the justice system falls short in one or maybe even most of those categories. So there is an element that I feel responsible for to allow the space to deliver on its promise to the people who come in to see me, right? So all of those things are on my mind when I go in. Now, specifically with regard to my identity, I should point out, and probably people in Iowa know this, but I'm the first African-American to hold this position in this particular district, which may sound a little bit surprising, but as Scott Stevens pointed out, Iowa doesn't have a lot of African Americans or really people of color in most of the state, although looking at the panel, that might be confusing to you, but I assure you, if I were to invite you here and take you around to a lot of the towns, we wouldn't see a lot of diversity in some places. So I get asked about that a lot, and I try to explain to people in terms that they can understand, because sometimes it's hard to relate your own experiences and your own viewpoints in a way that can be completely understood, because as has been mentioned by a couple of the other panelists, we all have different experiences. We all have different backgrounds, and all of those backgrounds and experiences have contributed to the people that we are today. And I think one of the things that we can do that is helpful is to learn. So believe it or not, when I'm sitting there on the bench, I'm also learning. I'm taking notes, I'm processing, I'm doing my job, but I'm learning. Why are these parties asking for what they're asking for? Why is this person reacting this way to this particular question? And all of that helps me to be a better judge. So I too am a student, and I look forward to learning more from the other panelists as well, and the questions. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you all for answering. Judge McKeever, you're not wrong that this panel does not exactly show that representation on that it shows up in Iowa, but the panel was strategic. So thanks for pointing that out. So we'll move on to the next question, and our next question will actually be for Dr. Maria Bruno. So in your opinion, how does racism impact survivors in the short term and long term? And then to add more to that, like how might this present when one is engaging with the justice system?
Ooh, okay, here we go.
Loaded questions.
Yes, short term, I just want you to think about whenever you experience any kind of trauma, right? Racism is considered a trauma as well. We might experience difficulty concentrating. We develop a sense of mistrust. Our sense of safety becomes compromised. We start questioning our own thinking. Our stress levels increase, which then results in increased worry, increased anxiety. And unfortunately, sometimes that can also lead to drinking, smoking, experimenting with drugs to kind of help alleviate the pain that we're experiencing. So that's short term. If we continue to experience racism in the long term, what it does, it actually increases our ability to die. And I don't want to sound dramatic, but really messes with our physical and our emotional well-being. There are tons of statistics and reports that talk about how not only experiencing trauma like just consistently, but there's something called anticipated racism, or there is also vicarious racism. So when we're worried about, am I going to experience this racist act? Or if I hear of my friends who have experienced acts of racism, all of that accumulates and it continues and it builds and it builds. And what it does, it's actually deteriorating our ability to fight infection which is one of the reasons why we see that most people of color are the folks who have higher cases of heart disease or hypertension, and we have increased morbidity. So there are so many negative effects that we have when we experience racism. But I wanted to really highlight anticipatory and vicarious racism because we don't often talk about that. And then how does that impact as well with the juvenile justice system? So we have to talk about intersectionality. We cannot just talk about racism in and of itself, right? We have to think about all the different dynamics and factors in our environment that can also impact. And as Judge McKeever mentioned, the juvenile or the justice system is disproportionately represented by people of color. And so we have now a very long negative history with people of color and law enforcement. The systems that were designed to protect all don't necessarily represent the same kind of protection for everyone. So that also negatively impacts our ability to move forward and for people to heal.
Great, thank you for that answer, Maria. I really appreciate the highlighting of that vicarious aspect of racism. Just like with vicarious trauma, it spreads everywhere. It's just not a contained thing. Our next question is for Judge McKeever and for Sergeant Scott. So from your own perspectives of the justice system, can you comment on how you see systemic and structural racism impacting people of color?
Judge, would you like to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is a question that I think is very important. When I spoke before about the need for a person in the criminal justice system, and specifically from the law enforcement side, to be humble, I think that's a key element that I would like to get across. We have to recognize that when we're dealing with a person of color, and as a white law enforcement officer, police officer, that they've seen the world through different eyes, and I may not be able to relate to that, but I can be humble to that. I also have to recognize that there's a historical component and a cultural component that's at play, probably in every interaction that I have, and that can present itself as historical trauma or cultural trauma, which means that a person can experience trauma or experience the effects of trauma that they haven't actually experienced themselves, that their ancestors have experienced, or that persons from their culture who they identify with have experienced. And so all of those things kind of wrap together in this complex sort of ball that can affect the interaction that law enforcement as a part of the criminal justice system is having with any individual. And so that's kind of on the outside of how things are. Internally, it's also very important for law enforcement officers or the system to understand what sort of biases we have and what those look like and how they express in the interactions we have with people of color. And I'll talk a little bit later also about things we can do down the road to have an effect on people that follow us and to mitigate issues that surround systemic racism in the justice system. But understanding those biases comes through education and being honest with oneself. I have to be honest with myself that I don't come from a diverse background, and how does that affect my day-to-day interactions? That needs to be on everybody, on every person, really everywhere. We're talking specifically about the criminal justice system, but that is how we overcome biases, by educating yourself on what it is, what biases you have, and how that can affect your interactions on a day-to-day basis. And it's got to be continual. It's got to be ongoing. And again, it requires that honest look in the mirror, a lot of internal thought, having that dialogue in your own mind about what it is that's at play and how that can affect the interaction you have with any person at any time.
So I have a very similar answer, I think. There are, you heard me mention fairness in my opening remarks, that the need to be fair. And fairness, I've said this many times, so the people on the panel may have heard this before, but fairness, in my view, has two very important components. Number one, there needs to actually be fairness. But number two, the individuals that we serve and the people that are being interacted with, whether it is by law enforcement or in the courtroom or touching any part of the criminal justice system or really any part of the justice system, need to actually believe that the fairness exists, because without both components, there really isn't fairness. And I always love to give a sports analogy to things, so I'll do it this time. So the Midwestern folks will get this rivalry between the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers. And if you're a Bears fan and you're in the Packers stadium and there's 1 second left on the clock and you think that your receiver has a touchdown and the hometown referee says it's an incomplete pass, there isn't going to be a single Bears fan in that stadium that believes it was an incomplete pass. They're all going to think it was a touchdown. And so I like to use that as kind of a lighthearted example to show how people's perspectives can be very different, even when they're present and see the exact same thing happen. But in order for us to deliver upon the promise of providing a fair justice system, we definitely need both components. And I agree that a lot of things will help us to get there. Education is one of the biggest things, I think. But a sense of compassion, understanding, patience, empathy, all those things are also important. And I try to bring those things into the courtroom to the extent that my position allows. Sometimes I have to bring the gavel down, and that's my job. But I like to also have those components that allow people to feel like they were treated fairly. I've always found that whether someone wins or loses, what would upset them most, even more than losing the case, is feeling they never had a fair chance to win the case. And so that fairness component is very, very important. So.
Yeah, thank you both for answering that. I really appreciate that you both, that mentioning of like honesty and fairness. And Judge McKeever, you mentioning like the two components, especially that second one, like the belief that it actually exists, right? Because if I don't believe it exists, it doesn't matter. And also that Bears versus Packers is a little too close to home for me. If it's definitely the Bears got that catch. So I just want to put that out there in case anyone, you can email me later for that. But we'll actually move on. And so the next question is for Chandrea Trotty. And the question is, how is racism inherent in funding sources through different funding streams and distribution?
Wow, that is a great question. As I introduced myself, a lot of what I do is oversee funding sources from a variety of different streaming funds. A larger part comes from federal government, trickle down and filter through the state, county, city, and then there are grants or philanthropy, given through philanthropy. What I can say is I probably put them into 4 different categories. That's funding in regards to the type of funding, the access to the funding, the allocation of the funding, and then the expectation of what organizations and or agencies should do with the funding and who they serve. When I think of the types of funding, most federal government's large multi-million and multi-billion grants are giving to white, mainstream, male-led organizations that then determine how those funds are allocated to smaller agencies. And normally those agencies are agencies that serve vulnerable populations, whether it is women or communities of color, low income, or some type of nuanced or very special form of pot of money. And so you have people making decisions on how to allocate that or distribute that money based on things they don't even know. They've not experienced it. They don't even understand the work that's being done. And what I will say to people oftentimes when they ask me as an example what I do, I say, I make decisions on behalf of people that don't even know we exist. And it should be burdensome, but oftentimes it's not, because a lot of people come from system to system and not necessarily from a grassroots perspective or have had a grassroots experience. And so again, there is a lot of guesstimating and problem solving on behalf of people, guessing what they would need and how they should receive the money to meet that need, as opposed to engaging those folks in the process and asking them what their problem is or where they see their challenges are, and how then can they support that in solving it and or helping and assisting in meeting the need. So there's that aspect. I think access is another large challenge when we talk about funding. Oftentimes, again, when there are larger wraparound resources, and when I say wraparound resources, I mean in a very holistic sense. I can go into an agency and receive housing assistance. I can receive mental health therapy. I can receive some type of financial education, for example. I am now connecting to people who have had an experience similar to mine. Again, that is normally white women are able to access those types of holistic, sustainable services. The difference in how folks access funding in the services that are funded is because there's a difference between hand-ups and handouts. Organizations that serve primarily folks of color, particularly Black women, it is considered a handout. For organizations that provide holistic, sustainable services, it is considered a hand up. And white women predominantly are able to access the services, and the demographic in which they advertise those services to are normally white women. Okay. Again, in the allocation of it and the expectation of how funding is then distributed and used, oftentimes, again, the funds are allocated in ways to organizations that serve marginalized communities or folks that hold vulnerable identities, in a way to see results and to conduct data analysis around and using it in a punitive way. So we want to take this one area that is economically stressed, full of people of color inhabit that area. It is full of dilapidated buildings, all of these things, right, that we hear stereotypically. And then we will give some money, and then we will do some research or some type of study to see if the money has benefited. If the services aren't delivered right, and I'm using my air quotes, then we tried it, it didn't work, leave them there. Okay, but I've gotten the data I need to prove that these services don't work here, the resources are wasted here, and there is no benefit. There's also because I believe that knowledge and resources is also a part of empowerment and sustaining funding in organizations that serve marginalized populations. A lot of money is given to a lot of these organizations without understanding of financial management, how grants work, how do we provide supportive services. Other white mainstream organizations become gatekeepers of that money and don't want to see it distributed, because if they feel that it threatens their own pot of money and the increase thereof. And so they start creating set-asides for organizations that serve communities of color, and expecting them to do the same amount of money with the same amount of work, with less money. So it always plays out in this way of white-led mainstream services who have the resources, the connections, or networks, I would say probably the support of sustainability, and all of these things in comparison to other folks who do not have any of those things. And so that's why you see so many organizations that are funded come and go, as opposed to white-led organizations that stay for decades and decades. And the way I see in changing that is a lot, but a large part of it is saying that sometimes work is not done in a traditional sense. There is a no one-size-fits-all model. We have to do a better job of engaging folks who in a diverse sense, and I mean that in every definition of the word, whether we are Black, we are Latinx, we are male identified, female identified, whether we are middle class, low income, whatever the case, whatever identities you hold, we have to start diversifying those tables and those decisions. We also have to start receiving information from those people that we wish to serve and asking them what's best for them, and as opposed to saying what's wrong with folks and then how we then are going to fix it. I also believe that we have to do a better job in teaching organizations and how to manage the funds, how those funds are allocated and dispersed. And we definitely have to do a lot of work around how the biases we hold and our expectations attached with the money. So I see it all of the time. It is shifting in smaller ways, but we have a lot of work to do. And it's been an uphill battle, and having the conversations about how money dictates services and who it dictates services on behalf of.
Thank you so much for that thorough answer, because I think we often forget to look at the way money is influenced by racism because it's so hidden from us the majority of the time, and it's such a pressing and controlling factor. And while we have you talking about this, I just kind of want to follow up. When in a meeting between you and Shalisa and I, you mentioned how the Victims' Compensation Fund is often used differently based on race. And I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about that, since I know a lot of people here have contact with the Victims' Compensation Fund.
Oh, absolutely. I think it starts with two things. One, notification of compensation benefits, and then how people access those benefits. Every state and U.S. territory has a crime victims compensation funds, millions of dollars. Most states, some are struggling indeed, but the reality of it is those compensation funds sit in different entities. For example, here in Iowa, it sits in the Attorney General's office in the Crime Victims Assistance Division. And you receive application as victims of crime. And the benefits is just that. It's a state insurance, more or less. We are in social contract with whether people know it or not, but the way the law is written, it says if we fail to protect you against a crime as a state, then we then owe it to you to actually some form of retribution, right? And a lot of times it comes in the form of financial assistance, immediate financial assistance. What we've learned is a lot of states are saying, well, we don't have, there are not a lot of people from communities of color, particularly Black families and or individuals accessing these compensation funds. If they do, it is usually because of a homicide. But then when we're talking about housing and we talk about, things even as what some people would deem simple as a car break-in, people don't know that money exists. The way we define crime and how we have allowed the law to define crime and the law to define victimization plays a large part in how people access those funds. And to give further clarity around that statement, what I will say is, for example, the normalization of violence in Black communities. I don't know I'm a victim of a crime if that has become so normal in my environment, right? I don't know that I am a victim, quote unquote, of a crime if everything that I have experienced in my environment, the history attached to that generationally, everyone has affirmed that the things that are taking place in my life is to be expected and that is just the way it is. And so then why would I access something that is really says through practice that it's for people who don't look like me? Only bad things happen to people who don't look like me. For me, it is just normal in that I just go, this really bad thing happened to me and I need to figure out then how to fix it, and I continue to move on. But those compensation dollars are there. And there you can get upwards here in the state of Iowa, sometimes higher in other states, with $16,000 worth of benefits that will treat you holistically from the crime itself all the way to mental health. We also have to do a better job of collaborating with law enforcement to offer that up. you know, that victims compensation money is available to those who have experienced various forms of crime, and also working again more in a multidisciplinary fashion to let folks know that that money exists and how they then refer survivors of crime to that fund and how to best utilize it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Yes.
Our next question is for Judge McKeever. So how does the buildup of racial stress impact individuals involved in the justice system? So this is from lawyers to judges to bailiffs to the person being charged.
Yeah, so I guess in a nutshell, it can have a great impact on anyone who moves through the justice system in a variety of ways. I'll just give a couple of examples. And those examples actually become more complex if you layer race on top of culture or national origin, and I'll explain some of that as well. So it's hard to get through more than 2 or 3 weeks here in this country watching television without seeing a special of some sort come on TV, advertised, talking about the justice system. And I have not conducted any sort of scientific survey, but I believe that based on my own personal experience, that more often than not, the special about the justice system does not describe what the justice system is doing well, but rather points out some shortcomings in the justice system. So I say that to say that it's going to be hard to run into anyone who isn't aware of some of the studies that have been done that point out disparities in our justice system. Now, when people have that information, they are going to have certain ideas about what is or isn't going to be available to them vis-a-vis the justice system, whether they're here for a civil case, a criminal case, etc. They will come in and they'll expect a certain type of treatment, and you can tell that by body language, facial expressions, and other sorts of cues. I will point out just briefly some experiences that I can point out that kind of layer together the racial stress along with additional complications, national origin. There was a gentleman who was charged with a crime in Minnesota. I was prosecuting the case, and the person, I could tell, was very stressed out, very nervous. He was talking to his attorney, but he didn't really want to talk to his attorney. And finally, I was trying to figure out what was going on because it wasn't a crime that was too terribly serious. So I pulled this attorney aside, a good defense attorney, and I asked him, I said, what's happening here? What's going on? And he said, I just can't get him to trust me. And I said, well, why don't you tell me more about that? And he said, well, from his perspective, it's simple. He says, I'm a state public defender, so I work for the state. You're a prosecutor, you work for the state. The judge is a state judge. And so everyone there is going to get together and decide what happens to me, no matter what I say. So I'm just not going to say anything, right? And so to understand that is the starting point, trying to loop back into how do we get to the point where the fairness thing exists, we have to somehow figure out how to break through these barriers and get to the point where we can provide the same fairness to that individual that we can to others. And so that's a challenge. And it is difficult when you think about all of the disparities that we are exposed to when we watch any of these television specials or attend national seminars where they will release the data from the studies that have been done. When you look at this data and think, how can we overcome this? And I think the answer is both simple and complicated at the same time. The answer is we have to try to overcome them by getting rid of the systemic barriers that exist, number one, but number two, by overcoming them one case at a time. In the particular case where that individual was there, I knew that we had a challenge in front of us, and we might never get that particular individual to the point where they can completely trust us, but my goal was, can we get it to the point where this person leaves and feel they were treated fairly in this instance? And even if that means that we had to spend an extra 20 minutes, hour, 2 hours, the investment is worth it, because what's going to happen is, if that person leaves the courtroom and does feel that they were treated fairly and had a fair chance, they're going to go tell all their friends. You know, we just watched that special over the last weekend. I'll, you know, take your pick. There are a million of them. I don't want to advertise, but you know, but you know, in this particular case, I think I got a fair deal. Now that's going to go a long way to break down some of those barriers, because there is an additional barrier that's put into place when someone comes in expecting a certain kind of treatment. Because as was said before, you know, if you come in and you think that there's no point in even saying anything, maybe saying something could be the key to having a little bit better outcome in your case, right? Or maybe saying something is the key, as was said by, you know, previously, getting the funding that you need for the restoration, right? And so the trust issue is a huge one, and it's one of the things that puts forth the barriers. You know, if you have a problem with trusting law enforcement in the first place, and someone steals all your stuff, you're gonna be like, oh, well, I'm not gonna call them, they're not gonna do anything anyway. Well, you know, if you don't call them, they certainly can't do anything. So just availing yourself of the services, feeling enough trust to avail yourself of the services is a huge barrier. And we, I think, have to be the ones to break that barrier down, because unless we do that, the folks that feel that way are not going to feel like they can take part in the system that really is for everyone. It's designed perhaps not in a perfect way. We need to make some adjustments to some of the policies that exist and some of the procedures that we have. But a good start is to deal with every case as it comes up and try to ensure that we provide the fairness in each and every case as it presents itself to us. And at the same time, somehow work holistically to try to reform things so that people don't have those feelings, right? I mean, once we remove those barriers, then that will be one of the keys to allowing people to have the trust that we want them to have. So yes, I see a lot, and it's a big challenge, but I believe that we can make some progress in that area.
Thank you, Judge McKeever. I really appreciate that your example from when you spent time in Minnesota, and then also thinking about overcoming barriers and that trust being one of those. I'm currently working through the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. Everyone should go get that book. One of the things that she talks about early on and then throughout the book is just like how trust can transform. And so, yeah, thank you. All right, so the next question here is for Chandrea Trotti. Bear with me. This is going to be kind of long. We're also going to bring back up the diagram because we're actually going to talk through this a little bit. So Chandrea, thinking about the ecological model and how there are different domains in which work needs to be done, what are your thoughts about how victim providers and folks employed within the justice system should be engaging? And then right now, specifically, and then also what are your thoughts on starting with one aspect, say the individual versus over another, and then so this could be like someone who learns a lot by reading, but may not be sharing that knowledge with others, or it could be someone who's doing a lot of protesting about racism, but they may not be doing much to explore their own, like how they perpetuate racism themselves.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Someone said it earlier, and I would like to reiterate that I think, first of all, in order to begin engaging and or opposing racist practices and or beliefs, you have to believe racism exists. I think that it is vital to practice some deep introspection. Cognitive dissonance is real. We like to believe that the messages, all of the messages that we have been fed, whether it be through people we love dearly and what they have told us as truth, all the way to what we see every day on the television or conversations that we hear and we buy into because it affirms something that has been deposited within us as a truth. I think we have to do some deep exploration and continue to always explore our beliefs, our biases, what we have told ourselves about various identities and what that looks like, assigning, right, all of these attributes and characteristics and looks to those things that we believe to be true. So I think it's first starting with self, you know, in short. I think the way that folks, we are in a very, some say unprecedented. I say because of, I've lived a little longer than some people, that it says nothing new under the sun, as my grandparents would say. However, I think what has changed is technology and the access to information. And the fact that anymore, we can broadly, you know, send a message in milliseconds and it's put out there for the world. And so you have, I guess where I'm going with that is to say that right now, you know, we have to think about ways that we are engaging and ways that we are first doing our self-work and then how we are distributing what we learned or how we are educating other folks on what we learned and how vulnerable we're willing to be as we are educating ourselves and having conversations outside of our comfort zone. I think the time is now because I don't believe in my so many years that I've seen it be prime ground that people are openly having conversations about race and racism and being very specific about what we're talking about and not using language, starting to rid ourselves of language that makes the topic of racism palatable. I think we're getting raw. I think we are willing to put our emotions out there and actually have our mind shift. And so I think what we can be doing right now is just engaging whichever way is comfortable. And when I say comfortable, at whichever level you're at, I think I just believe we all believe everyone should be doing one thing at the same time, but we are different individuals. We have had different walks of life and different experiences. We receive information differently, all of those things, perception and perspective. Where you sit is not necessarily where I sit. And so I think it's just a matter of engaging in whichever way and at the level you are now. If it is self-educating and reading, all the way to rallying and protesting, holding someone accountable. For example, I hear a lot of people saying that one of the most difficult things is to start to speak a new truth on their social media that is full of people they are comfortable with and that they love and that they are in deep relationship with, and actually opposing their beliefs and their views around race and racism and how society and or how they as individuals are engaging with people of color. And that taking a step and saying, you know, no, you're wrong. For someone, that's huge. You know, they are willing to lose the relationship based on taking a stand for something else that they've now shifted their belief around. I think that it's also the time to really think about who folks are serving. You know, when we're talking about victim service providers, those involved in the justice system, who are you seeing? What are you noticing about your own behaviors that are not in alignment with what your mission, vision, and passion is in your work? So for example, if I'm providing services, am I providing services no matter what it is in an equitable manner? Am I giving the same access? Am I providing the same information? Am I showing the same amount of grace? Am I making excuses for some and not for others? Am I giving, you know, what I have noticed more than anything is that we are not quick to give people of color, particularly again, Black people, the benefit of the doubt. Are we willing to do things as simple as that and say, you know, I'm not going to put a caveat on how I show you compassion, grace, love, acceptance, and understanding? Or am I going to assign something that has been inherently put in me to you so that it puts a barrier up or challenges me to serve you in a more, like you said, Judge McKeever, fairness, right, in a fair manner. So I think it is a litany of things. And in regards to the second part of your question, I think I've touched that to say, no matter where you are, if you're just picking up a book for the first time and you are reading terminology and concepts that are new to you and you seek to apply it, that to me can be just as big as a step as someone standing in front of millions of people and leading a protest, a rally, influencing policy, or anything else. I think we all have a role. I think we should operate in that role, be supportive of one another and where we are in regards to growth and progress, and continue to extend grace. And I think if we do that, we get much further than demonizing those who may not be where we are.
Yeah, for sure. I think the only thing I would like to also add is maybe starting with love, right? And making sure that that's woven in all of those interactions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that answer. Our next question kind of follows in line with that, and it's for Dr. Bruno. So Dr. Bruno, how can we disrupt harm at each of the different ecological levels? And do you think that there is a particular order of steps people need to follow right now? And what might be some of like the impact or implication of starting and working in one area, but maybe neglecting some of the others?
Also a complex question, but thank you, Chandra, for your answers. I really resonated with everything you said, so thank you for that. Let me look at the question one more time. I apologize. So how can we disrupt harm at each of the different ecological levels? I think Chandra actually did a really nice job sharing a lot of different ways that we can do that. I can add some that are a little bit more concrete. So on an individual level, as a provider or someone who's working with a survivor, we can teach conflict resolution, we can offer life skills training. From a relational standpoint, as I listened to Chandra, I thought about a lot of conversations that I'm having with my white colleagues. And my white colleagues are specifically saying, I don't understand why BIPOC folks don't trust me. And so when we go back to the word trust, right, I would encourage folks to really think about what that means and to not expect survivors to trust you because in your mind, you think you're doing something good because you're the person who's there to help them. These are individuals who've been betrayed by other individuals. And so I really like Scott's approach of listening, learning, and the judge's, I can't see your last name, I'm sorry, his statement of empathy, right? Like really getting to that place when you can empathize with an individual who is in a lot of pain and honoring their story. So I would really encourage folks to think about that as you are working with the survivor. You're not better than the survivor. You are alongside with them and amplifying their voices. And so from a community perspective, right, you are there really to show them to support, to amplify that voice, and to be a critical thinker and to look at policies and procedures and say, hey, there's a loophole in this, or this doesn't seem like it's equitable for everyone. What can we do to change that? Because there's a lot of power in the pen. And what I mean by that is we really oppress folks through our policies and procedures across schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, things of that nature. So really think about your positionality and how you can have that critical eye and how you can advocate for the people that you're working with. And then from a societal standpoint, I think not being okay with the norms. One of my biggest pet peeves is when someone says, well, that's just the way we've always done things, right? Like that's the norms. Those are our rules. I would encourage you to challenge that and to ask, like, help me understand why we have a dress code. Help me understand why my colleague who doesn't identify as a woman feels like they have to change before they come into this setting to represent more feminine so they could be accepted in this space. How is that okay? Help me understand. Who is this for? So really, once again, utilizing our voices, utilizing our level of education, our privileges, our platforms to come together and to highlight those things. But you need to show up. Don't just expect that because you're the helper, right, that folks are going to trust you. You need to show up, you need to listen, and you need to understand and do whatever you can to be able to understand. And is there a right way? No. My inclination is to start with yourself, because I can control what I do. I can take responsibility for how I treat folks. So I would say do that, but we have to do all of them at the same time. And one day I might be working on an individual piece, and Shalisa might be working on the relational piece, and Chandra is going to be working on the community piece, and Dr. Greenbaum is going to be in the societal piece. Like, we all have to work across all of the domains, and we're going to be in those spaces at different times. So I would say just show up, listen, and connect with that empathic piece of yourself.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's important to remember that, like, starting with ourselves is important. But then also, one of the things you said that really resonated with me is that, like, we're working with survivors, not for them. And so making sure that they're a part of that process as we work through these things. So thank you. So we're gonna round out the panel discussion with one more question, and this will actually go to Scott Stevens. And so, do you have any suggestions or thoughts on how to adapt services to account for societal trauma and racism in the way that we've described them earlier during the presentation?
I think we should take advice from every person on this panel. I think it's been outstanding to hear the perspectives. We hear Judge McKeever talking about fairness, about correcting the system, changing the system one case at a time. We hear from Ms. Trotty about the importance of including groups when we look to adapt or to make changes. We hear other things about questioning the norms. I'll tell you, it's an uphill battle. There's two things that cops don't like, and one is that nothing ever changes and change, right? So it is an uphill battle, but it's on us. We have to be accountable, not just with every single interaction, as Judge McKeever explained, but for the system that we represent. I'm proud to be a representative of the criminal justice system. I do understand the harms that it can cause, but yeah, just as we've heard, handling it one case at a time, making sure you're doing what you can to mitigate any influence of bias in the interaction, and understanding where a person is coming from. We talk about what is the sense of justice, and it comes across today as what is fair. And we have a strong ability to influence justice. Justice starts from the moment that a person is victimized by crime. What does that interaction look like? Do they receive affirmation of that? But moving on to how we can change and what we can do, from my perspective, education is the most important component. You've heard me talk about it. I've had the unique experience over the past 2 years to manage a large grant from a large institution to improve our response to domestic and sexual assault while learning about bias, and particularly gender bias, but really that crosses over a lot of categories. But we found that education had an incredible impact on our officers' interactions with the public, with victims of crime, with persons who are incarcerated or suspect of crime. And so education is a huge component. And the other big theme that came from those 2 years of working hard and working in partnership with the community is the value of partnership. We can't do this in a vacuum. We need everybody at the table, not just police officers from the criminal justice system or judges or other things. We need to bring and make sure our community is at the table. I have found a big resource of mine, especially in working with victims of domestic violence, is advocates, making sure that you've got them with you at the table, and they can kind of cover that gap where I can't exactly understand what's going on with the person, the survivor of domestic assault. So let's have that person there with us that does, and partnering. Lev Vygotsky talked about the principle of the zone of proximal development. And basically what it means is that, you know, we can advance ourselves and I can learn as much as I can learn and do what I can do. But that's a small degree compared to what I can do in partnership with someone else. And that goes to the institution. Develop those partnerships, make them important, and be deliberate about it. You know, one of the things that Ms. Trotty talked about was don't guess what a particular group of people need. Don't take a guess and try to implement something. One of my partners in the community used the phrase, nothing about us without us. And again, that goes back to the need for those partnerships so that we're not throwing something out there and saying, you know, this is going to help you. We need to engage those communities and find out what it is that we can do together. And so that's where I think it is moving forward with education in partnership with the community through trauma-informed systems in the justice system.
I really love that answer, Scott, for a number of reasons. And one of them is going back to the community agreements that Shalisa went over at the beginning of together we know a lot. And we have to bring all of our voices together and make space for one another to be able to really hear and see what's going on and how we can all be part of the solution together. So very well said. And I'm very grateful for you all answering our questions. And we are just about out of time for our presentation today. So we do have a couple questions that came in, if you would be all right with starting with some of those. So one of the questions that came in is, as a white cisgender sexual assault advocate, what is the best thing I can do for a survivor when they feel they are experiencing racism in the justice system? And I'll let anybody jump in who would like to, including Shalisa, who is an advocate.
I'm gonna go ahead and let the panel tackle this, and then I can add in at the end if we need to.
All right, I'll give it a shot here. I mean, I would say that just based on my own experience in the field, that one of the most important things to do is to take time to listen and to ask questions to gain a greater understanding of the perspective. And that's always a good first step to advancing any conversation that is coming from someone who has a different perspective. And that's just been, my experience has been where things go off the rails is if you hear the first few parts of the explanation and then jump in and say, well, I understand this, I'm going to explain the rest of it to you. Then they'll say, okay, well, I guess you know all about it, so can I go home now? You know, whereas if you say, okay, tell me more about that. You know, so when did this happen to you? And tell me more about how that feels. And then there's a chance to really gain information and gain trust, because then one of the things that really shuts down the conversation is if the person doesn't think that you can understand and or thinks that you're not interested in trying to understand. And so that would be my suggested approach. Listen, ask questions, listen carefully, and empathy. Getting back to the empathy thing, empathize, and I think that would be the approach that I would suggest. What does everybody else think?
I'll jump in. Thank you, Judge McKeever. I would just say, believe them. Your experience is yours. Your truth is not to be negated, dismissed, questioned, diminished, any of those things. And even for those, you know, who work with victims and or survivors, we know that the biggest thing is believability, right? And believing authentically, not as a faux affirmation, but their experience is just that, their experience, perception, and perspective. And I've got to believe that if someone states something, then there is validity to that. So yes, that would be my biggest suggestion, is just to believe them and affirm their experience.
So I do want to recognize again that we are just going over time. So any of our panelists who need to jump off, or participants, please feel free to do so. We are grateful to have you all here today. One other question came in that I think is really important that I would like to ask, if that's all right. So who can stay on, please feel free to try to answer. Someone asked, many individuals who cause harm are victims of societal violence and trauma that have been normalized, such as poverty, hunger, racism, etc. How can we as a society hold individuals accountable for harm caused while also accounting for the harm that has been done to them?
I can try this one. So I used to work for the 19th Judicial Circuit as a staff therapist, and I worked with these kind of individuals. And one of the things that I learned and I appreciated about it is I had to work with sex offenders, and I didn't think that I would be able to. I was a young parent, and my supervisor at the time said, if you're going to be a good psychologist, you should be able to find that empathy piece and work with everyone. In the moment, I was really angry with him. And I was upset because I was like, you just don't get it. You don't have little ones, but he did. I just wasn't listening to him in the moment. And as I listened, and it goes back to the word listening, right? I learned that this individual had been a victim themselves of sexual assaults. And not that that makes it okay, but being able to understand their experiences, I was better able to empathize with their experience, and then was better able to provide some treatment recommendations from a restorative practice lens, combined with him while telling him, you know, you have a choice and you make choices to do good or bad, to cause harm or to stop the harm. How can we move forward so that you don't cause any more harm and so that you also heal? So I would just encourage us to remind ourselves that, you know, it's easy for me to judge if I haven't been through that experience, but to find that place, had I had those similar exact experiences, would I act any different? Maybe, maybe not. And so that was something that was able to help me through that journey.
Yes, I totally agree. If I could just add one thing, I think that when we look at anything that works for the benefit of people in our society, we need to ask ourselves, why do we have that thing? In the case of laws, what do the laws exist for? One possible explanation is that our laws are supposed to make things more fair and more safe. And so when we think about what it is that we actually do when an individual transgresses the laws, we need to consider whether or not we are serving those purposes. And so as a further way to explain this in the time that we have left, I will simply say this. We know that well over 90% of the people who go to prison at some point will be returned to the society. The question is, can they return to society in a manner that's going to allow those folks to participate in society in a meaningful and productive way? And if the answer is generally no, then we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we need to change to allow that to happen? And so the balancing of protecting society and making society more fair really is not a balancing, but those two things actually go hand in hand. If we can create for ourselves a future justice system that serves those purposes, then I think we can not only balance those interests, but recognize that those interests are very, very closely connected. To create a safer society, or rather to create a more fair society, is to create a safer society. And I think those are the things that we need to think about as we look at trying to reform those things that can help us to create the kind of society that we're looking for.
Thank you, Judge McKeever.
Well, we are officially out of time. What an incredible panel and presentation. Thank you so much to everybody for attending. Thank you to our incredible panel, our moderators, for being here today, having this conversation, everybody being open and willing to learn from one another. I know that there's certainly a lot that I will take away from this, and this is an ongoing process, as you know, was really honed in on. This is not a one-time thing, but something that we must continuously have these discussions about. And I'm just very grateful for all of you for being a part of it. If you are interested in attending a future Free to Thrive training, please check out our website. We have a training page on there. The link is on your screen. And we will continue to have this dialogue and continue to, especially talking about being trauma informed and what that means in all these different aspects. The contact information of both Dr. Greenbaum and Shalisa Gladney and myself are here. If you had a question that we didn't get to today or want to connect with any of us, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to connect with you further. And just have a great day. Thank you all for being a part of this, and hope to see you at a future training. Take care.